Refined carbohydrates and cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the United States across both sexes and all races. The predominant concern in heart disease prevention has been saturated fatty acid reduction, although current evidence suggests that highly refined carbohydrates may have an even greater effect in the development of cardiovascular disease. It has been evaluated by James D. Nicolantonio that Eskimos residing in Greenland are at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease as compared to non-Eskimo populations. From 1855 to 1955, the intake of refined carbohydrates has increased from 2 to 8% to 40%, further paralleling the risk of atherosclerotic disease. Going forward, it is important to consider why refined carbohydrates contribute to overall health decline and the development of cardiovascular disease in industrialized countries. When evaluating the effect of carbohydrates on chronic disease development, the total amount of carbohydrates is less important as compared to the quality. Glycemic index is a tool developed to aid primarily diabetic individuals in identifying foods that have the smallest effect on blood glucose levels. Glycemic index utilizes a scale of 0 to 100, with lower numbers characterizing foods digested and absorbed the slowest, and higher numbers those that are quickly digested and absorbed, causing a rapid rise in blood sugar levels. As you can see in this chart, refined carbohydrates, for example, white bread, yields a high glycemic index, meaning it is going to result in a rapid rise in blood sugar levels. The other food groups listed here, vegetables, fruits, dairy, and proteins, tend to yield a lower glycemic index as compared to grains and starches. Glycemic load is another tool utilized to describe the quantity and quality of a carbohydrate source. This is calculated through the product of a food's glycemic index in addition to the amount of carbohydrate in grams provided by a food serving. A diet high in glycemic index and glycemic load is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. A high carbohydrate intake, especially refined carbohydrates, can raise fasting triglycerides, reduce high-density lipoprotein, and increase blood glucose and insulin. These meals high in refined carbohydrates can substantially increase postprandial blood glucose and insulin. The subsequent insulin-induced decline in blood glucose triggers hunger within a few hours, stimulating further consumption, often of other foods of a high glycemic index, so that blood glucose levels remain elevated over a prolonged time period. Hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia may trigger peripheral vasoconstriction, sodium retention, and increased very low density lipoprotein production, leading to the development of atherosclerosis. In the consideration of individuals with a high body mass index, the greater need for insulin in response to a diet high in glycemic index and glycemic load may further lead to insulin resistance and lipid abnormalities, increasing cardiovascular disease risk. Shown in this intertwined pathway is the effect of food, primarily those of high glycemic load, and the pathways through which coronary heart disease can be acted upon. The 5 end stages that are considered hallmarks of coronary heart disease include hypercoagulability, hypercholesterolemia, hyperglycemia/hyperinsulinemia, inflammatory state, and hypertension. To review a few of the included pathways, elevated blood glucose levels can be a result of a diet high in glycemic load, which in turn can result in both hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia. High glycemic load diets lead to an increase in phosphoinositide 3 kinases to mitogen-activated protein kinase ratio, also known as the P13K to MAPK ratio. This increase, in turn, results in insulin resistance. Decreased insulin sensitivity due to insulin resistance results in increase in serum levels of platelet factors, such as fibrinogen, and increased potential for hypocoagulability, one of the hallmarks of coronary heart disease. Lastly, high glycemic load diets can decrease plasma adiponectin levels and insulin sensitivity by decreasing muscle fat oxidation and subsequently causing increased vasodilation. Although a high carbohydrate diet should be avoided due to its association with the development of cardiovascular disease, it is also important to discuss the risks associated with a diet high in other macronutrients. Two of the most prevalent adverse effects that may result due to a prolonged excess protein consumption, 2 to 3 times that of the recommended dietary allowance, are renal dysfunction and loss of bone mass. The breakdown of protein into amino acids results in ammonia produced as a byproduct. Being that ammonia is toxic in the body, it undergoes a pathway known as the urea cycle to convert ammonia to urea. Higher protein diets are going to result in higher rates of urea synthesis as urea excretion reflects protein intake. Once produced, urea travels in the blood to the kidneys in order to be excreted via urine. Due to the sustained glomerular filtration occurring by the kidneys to excrete these waste products, high protein diets may lead to an increase in renal dysfunction or disease. High protein diets may also lead to a loss in bone mass due to the increased urinary excretion of calcium. This increased loss of calcium can lead to a loss in bone mass and subsequently lead to diseases such as osteoporosis. High fat diet, on the other hand, also depends on the quality as opposed to the quantity. This can be supported by the food matrix, indicating that different fats can be metabolized differently in the body and different fat sources are deemed as healthier. Saturated fat is consumed in excess of the dietary guidelines for Americans of less than 10% of total energy intake, leading to the development of cardiovascular disease and negatively affecting plasma and lipid levels. Trans fatty acids raise low-density lipoprotein levels, further increasing the risk for cardiovascular disease. Additionally, trans fatty acids are associated with dysregulation of processes such as lipid metabolism, inflammation, oxidative stress, and endoplasmic reticulum stress, and are positively associated with weight gain and waist circumference changes. Monounsaturated fat intake is seen as being neutral in regard to effects on cardiovascular disease risk, whereas polyunsaturated fats, including omega-3 and omega-6, both decrease the risk for cardiovascular disease. In conclusion, it is important to note that all macronutrients should be consumed in quantity of those recommended by the Institute of Medicine macronutrient distribution range. This includes 40 to 65% of energy from carbohydrates, 10 to 35% of energy from protein, and 20 to 35% of energy from fat. Although, when considering consumption, it is not always quantity that matters as much as quality. For example, carbohydrates of a higher glycemic index and glycemic load are much more strongly associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease as opposed to those with lower glycemic index and glycemic load. As a future dietitian, it is imperative to educate individuals on these tools to further aid them in the prevention of chronic disease development.